For you?
I'm very well. It's a really dreary day here on the coast of Maine. And it's cool. So we're still waiting for something resembling summer to arrive. It gets here late and it leaves early. Anyway, I was just rereading all of the selections that I chose for you, and thinking how well they complemented the ones that Professor Mitchell assigned last week. Starting again with the preface, and I wanted to start with two thoughts of Tocqueville's. And one is that he says he is a liberal of a different kind. And that has raised among scholars a lot of questions about what did he mean by being a liberal of a different kind. And then the other is, that's not in Democracy in America, that's in a letter that he writes. But the one that's in Democracy in America, which is very interesting, and that is that we need a new political science for a world that is altogether new. And I thought it might be interesting just to go back and think about Aristotle and the way in which Aristotle classifies regimes from the Politics, where he talks about 6 simple forms of regime: monarchy, tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, polity, and democracy. Tocqueville has a different classification. He proceeds in a way that he thinks is not as philosophical, which raises questions about whether he's a philosopher or a sociologist. He is certainly, in my view, a philosopher, but not a philosopher in a systematic sense. His philosophy is drawn in a way like Aristotle from the ground up. As he says right in the preface, I'm not going to make the facts conform to my ideas, but rather I'm going to make my ideas conform to the facts. And the fact that he sees is that the world anciently was aristocratic, and that includes even democratic Athens. Athens had slaves. It's a slave world. It's not just these outlier nations like the South in the United States that have slavery, but that slavery is universally practiced. And gradually, he thinks the political forces begin to shift. And I think that it's really important to note, and it's in one of the readings for today. I think, like, just a second, it's on page 412, where he says that it was necessary for Jesus Christ to come down to earth to introduce the idea of equality. So what you have there is a really important and interesting idea. Tocqueville does not give much recognition or place much emphasis on the modern social contract theorists, starting with Hobbes, Locke, and of course his own Frenchman Rousseau, for introducing equality in the state of nature. What Tocqueville is looking at is not how were we in some time, abstract time before we set up political societies. He takes a much more historical approach, and in that he follows Montesquieu rather than Rousseau or Hobbes and Locke. And so he finds the origin of equality not in the Leviathan or the Second Treatise of Government, or even the Second Discourse, or in the teachings of those works, but in the fact of Christ's appearance in the world, because this for him indicates that all human beings, Christianity is a universal religion. It promises to bring hope and salvation to men and women everywhere in the world. It's not like the ancient religions of the ancient city, which are much more particular. And so he sees this, that we are all human beings created in the image of God. And that is the source of our equality. And this takes millennia to work itself out into politics. And so in the preface, he talks about the admission of the lower classes to the priesthood, to the clergy, beginning in the 700s. So you see this great historical sweep that he is taking, rather than here's an abstract state of nature, and then there's civil society, and we're going from one state to the other. No, it's this just majestic sweep that begins little by little to lay the foundation for the democratic revolutions that Tocqueville and his near ancestors lived through. And so it's this. And then he also credits other things. One thinks of Abraham Lincoln in his great speech on inventions and discoveries. Inventions and discoveries play an important role in the place of equality and the emergence of modern democracy. Such things, and we don't think about this all that often. I know Hannah Arendt talks about it in The Human Condition. Tocqueville also talks about it in the preface, that there are inventions, for instance, the printing press. The printing press makes possible the publication of the Bible. The fact that now everyone can have a Bible or own a Bible, at least in theory, and eventually everyone does, means that it sets the stage for the Protestant Reformation. You can't have a Protestant Reformation that emphasizes, for instance, sola scriptura, that you are saved only by what is in Scripture and not by any of the teachings of the church that have been developed to explain Scripture. But Scripture itself is so important, and that in turn depends on the invention of the printing press and the fact that Bibles now become more available. And you can see the way in which he assimilates this to his discussion of the American mind in the first sections of the second volume, where he says Americans are Cartesian, meaning they doubt everything. They, show me, prove it to me. But they don't even have time to read Descartes because they're too busy working, trying to improve their condition in life. But they're instinctively Cartesians. But he also in there mentions Luther, and that I think is important. Luther's beginning of the starting of the Protestant Reformation in 1517. So all of these things are adding to the momentum of democracy. And then Tocqueville says in his letter, I am a liberal of a different kind. And many scholars have paused over that, tried in some way to pin down what Tocqueville means when he says that. I myself have done it. So I'm going to just try to distill a few of those ideas. One, if you again start from something Professor Mitchell said last week, Tocqueville introduces in his introduction the idea that history and democracy are providential. And this is really interesting because what you have in Tocqueville's own lifetime is this difference between people like Kant and Hegel, who are introducing ideas about the movement of history. Hegel especially, in which he says even the great men are really the puppets of history, that history is propelling them to do things even behind their backs. And so Tocqueville, in a lot of his letters, writes and says, gosh, at the time of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, people thought they could change the world. I mean, you have that great line from Thomas Paine, we have it in our power to begin the world anew. That leads to disastrous consequences in France. But now all of a sudden you have this fatalism that history is just propelling us and history is calling all the shots and we have no agency at all. And Tocqueville writes a number of letters about this, especially to Gobineau, and dealing partly with his essay on the inequality of the races. So this, in part, his reliance or his invocation of providence is a way of emphasizing that there are things beyond our control. But this has to do with his belief that religion is so important. This is what the Americans get right, what the French get so terribly wrong. The French get it wrong because their institutions were so implicated. Their religious institutions were so implicated in the old regime that when the old regime went, religion went out with it. But the Americans understand the significance of religion, and it's also Protestant religion, which brings us back to a question from that I was thinking about after last session was over with Hugo's question about Latin America. And Latin America is, of course, Catholic, and the United States was founded as a Protestant country. And this makes a big difference, too, in how religious mores work themselves out and in a particular society. So he's emphasizing providence, and what he wants to say is that there are some general forces beyond our control, but we are not determined by history, that history is too fatalistic, or this is history with a capital H, that history is moving all events along and we have no control over it. And so he is emphasizing that, again, this serves several purposes, because if it's Jesus Christ, that makes religion rather important. And it also reminds us of the importance of the soul. And I think this is a critical ingredient of Tocqueville's discussion of democracy and a new kind of political science. He's a new kind of liberal Democrat. He's a kind of liberal Democrat who recognizes the importance of finding a way of combining religion and politics, not suppressing it, not evicting it from the public realm. Of course, he is very much a champion of the separation of church and state, but he sees that in the United States, the two work hand in hand. And that, by comparison with what is going on in France, is part of Tocqueville's new political science. It's part of the way in which he understands himself to be a liberal of a different kind. So the importance of religion. Well, what does religion do? And again, Professor Mitchell touched on some of these themes last time, so I'll just mention a few that Tocqueville talks about. The first is that it limits the will of the majority. Tocqueville, in Democracy and America, refers to what he calls the impious and detestable maxim that the people can do everything, that they have no higher authority or principle to which they must submit their own judgment, be it reason, be it natural law, be it God, be it the Ten Commandments. You can't just take off all the aristocrats and have and kill them all. You need to limit your the sense that the majority, by definition, is always right. So religion does that, and religion, providence, the soul, all these ideas are connected in Tocqueville's understanding of his new liberalism. Religion, of course, focuses on the soul. And in one of the readings that I assigned for you today on why Americans have such an exalted spiritualism, why you have these, again, these weird religions that pop up. And that, and Tocqueville says, it's as a consequence of spending so much time thinking about how to satisfy the needs of the body, that democracies have a tendency to do that, and religion offsets that tendency, reminds us that as human beings, we are this strange mixture of body and soul, and that if we emphasize too much the needs of the soul, the body suffers. But that's not the problem in our age. Our age is all about keeping that body in tip-top shape, and maybe a little bit of 15 minutes of meditation, saying and that is taking care of the needs of the soul. And so Tocqueville reminds us that the soul has needs that must be satisfied. And when they're not satisfied, we become deranged in some way. We don't, as the French do, because they have given up on religion, commit suicide. But he says we go mad. So that's one part of his comparative politics. The French commit suicide, we go mad. And he has some evidence for that. Also, religion gets us to look beyond the immediate, obviously. I mean, if eternal life is the great teaching of every great religion, how you get there, what it means, different in different cases, but in every case, it is the longing for immortality. We as human beings are the only creatures who know we're going to die. And we long not to die or to live on immortally. This is very different from the way in which ancient religion operated. And Tocqueville says he suggests, I think, very strongly that the fact that almost everyone has this desire for immortality, that there may be a kind of religious tropism that is part of human nature. And the best thing to do is to acknowledge it and give it its rightful place. So a liberalism that somehow takes seriously the place of religion in a democratic society is very much needed. It also, of course, counters our love of material gratification. If all we're thinking about is, we're foodies and we're thinking about the next great French meal that we may have, or the next great French wine that we may drink, then suddenly, where are the needs of the soul? We know people. Obsessions are with material gratification, the ways in which they work out, the ways in which they scrutinize everything that goes into their mouth. We are obsessed with the needs of the body. And part of what religion does is at least to get us back to thinking about the needs of the soul. It also plays a legitimate role. He says everybody needs dogmas. There are certain things we just have to take on faith. And he thinks that the best things to take on faith are the things that a religion that stays, as we would put it today, in its own lane. And doesn't try to organize all of our life, our daily activities, but just basically tells us what our duties to ourself are, our duties to other people, and our duties to God. If it can do that, that is the best and situation for us to be in, and religion can help us in that respect. He also, in the preface and throughout the text at various places, talks about, with a certain amount of sarcasm, the way in which the French think they got it right with respect to religion just by sweeping it off the stage. And he talks about how smart they think they are, that's what they've done. And that's the one area in which he says the Americans really have exceeded the French. That, and of course, his emphasis on decentralization, because the French are the centralizers par excellence. They started this during the era of the monarchs, but they didn't get rid of it. And he makes that comment in one of the sections that I asked you to read, about how the only thing that remains constant is the passion for centralization. And in the America, we have, or at least we used to have, a great passion for decentralization. And Professor Mitchell was talking about these mediating institutions, these institutions that come between us and the great central power, the federal government, the national government. These can be our states, they can be our localities, they can be our churches, they can be our schools, they can be our neighborhood associations, they can be all of the organizations to which we belong. That all of this is a way of shielding us from the direct power of the central government. And of course, we have the last 3 chapters that I assigned for you to look at, which raise the question of whether anybody has escaped this bureaucratic centralization, and that includes even the United States. But that, we'll get to that a little bit later. By the way, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to raise your hand and just interrupt. I think it would perhaps break up the listening. I'm doing all the talking, you're doing all the listening. I have terrible nightmares of the Zoom years, and I don't really want to go back there. So if at any point you want to talk, please interrupt me, because anything you have to say is worth exploring. So give it a shot as soon as I say something that prompts your response. And one other point from the preface, we haven't gotten very far yet, have we? But Tocqueville says that he was overcome with a religious terror. And that's something that in my own writing I've unpacked a little bit. And one of the things that I think these are the passions that attend our awe and reverence for the spiritual, for the deity, fear, a terror, which the 2 passions are fear and hope. I mean, we're afraid of divine punishment. We hope for divine life, eternal rewards. But Tocqueville shows us how later on, whenever he uses the terms fear and hope, how these can also be applied to the secular world, to this world, and not simply to religion. But he is overcome with a religious terror about what democracy means. And if democracy becomes all enveloping, then of course, what we have to fear and what we have to hope will also come from democracy and not just from religion. So that, just by way of a general introduction to, we need a new political science, and I think that's what Professor Mitchell was getting at with his emphasis on mediating religions, mediating institutions, and also religions last time. Did I leave anything out, Josh? Do you want to add something? Please.
No, I'm listening intently.
I wanted to take a sip of tea, and I was hoping you did. Okay, well, let's go back to listening intently. One of the interesting things, a couple of other aspects of Tocqueville's distinctive political science, that he sees the world turning on two axes: first the aristocratic axis, and then the democratic axis. But not the classification of regimes that Aristotle had talked about. He's also for a new kind of liberal. Another aspect of this is that he's concerned with greatness. He's concerned with greatness precisely at a time that democracy makes every individual feel so weak. And he talks about that in his chapters on individualism. And Tocqueville's discussion of individualism is quite distinctive. For one thing, it doesn't just mean that we are radically individuals, the way that you might think of Theodore Roosevelt, a rugged American individual on the frontier. He means not just a single person. He means also that we withdraw from the public arena. I think of this all the time with my students. If they're not getting involved in activities on campus, and what they really want to do is just hang out with the kids on their floor in their dorm, order a pizza, get a movie, and not go to the orchestral performance or the great hockey game, but they're just going to stay in, because individualism doesn't mean that you're simply all alone. As he says, you withdraw into the bosom of your family and friends, but that makes you lose any appetite or interest in larger public affairs. And I think that does give Tocqueville's discussion of individualism a certain distinctive character. But the basic point is that individuals, even in their little pods or the family bosom, if that sounds a little more welcoming, feel themselves to be very weak. And so one of the things that Tocqueville wants to do is to emphasize greatness. And Tocqueville's political writings, all of them manifest a concern with greatness. This is not just the fearful side of liberalism, that you want to get out of the state of nature because it's become so dangerous, but it's a kind of risk-taking and a greatness-producing activity. So he's not in the Hobbesian camp, he's not in the Machiavellian camp, but in some ways he's closer to that, to the Machiavellian camp, in that he is concerned with greatness here and now, especially in politics. And this for individuals, that he wants to create great human beings, and he also wants nation states to be great. And so with that in mind, he defends emancipation of the French Caribbean colonies from slavery. He defends colonialism. These are efforts that he thinks will add to French greatness and grandeur. He's also very critical of the bourgeois politics of King Louis Philippe. And he wants to see somehow something great happen during that monarchy. And obviously he thinks that it doesn't happen, but during that period, it's why he himself takes up a couple of great French causes. So in the sections that I asked you to read, he starts out on page 52. I don't have to look in my book. I know it. I know where it is by heart. With that brief description of the difference between aristocracy, between two kinds of democracy. He's already made the point that there's only aristocracy or democracy. And he warns that you can have a manly equality. And so I point out to you that it's even hard to say a manly equality because already you're going to offend so many people, which is to say that maybe we can only have equality in servitude if we can't even use words like manly. But he does talk about a manly equality, that one, in other words, that admires and the people who have succeeded, who you congratulate people who have accomplished something, whereas an equality in servitude is one that this is the gentler side of Nietzsche. That this is it's an equality that really is based on democratic envy or resentment, and what you want to do is tear down those who have achieved something. And so if democracy is coming, the great choice is, what's it going to look like? Is it going to be equality, a manly equality, one that combines with liberty? Or is it going to be a slavish kind of equality that wants to tear down everything and drag everyone down to the same common denominator? And I think then in the second volume, he talks about why it is that democratic societies like equality more than freedom. And they're really interesting points to consider. But you can see the inequalities all around you. If somebody's driving a very expensive car and somebody is walking along on foot or driving a rusted old car, you can see what the differences are. You can drive up and down blocks and see that some people live in great homes and other people are living in much more reduced circumstances. And so the examples of inequality are everywhere, whereas the examples of freedom are much harder to pin down. And this, I think, has to do with, in part, because freedom is not as material. It's not as evident. The fact that you can get up and read, that you have books, that you have sources of information, that you can form an opinion. These things are much more abstract. They're fleeting. You can try to organize people to do something about something going on in your child's school, or you can, if you are students, you can organize to try to change things on your own campus. But this is not as immediately evident as are the instances of inequality, which seem all around. And of course, you can see how when freedom becomes license, you can see the danger of that right away. So for all these reasons, Tocqueville says that we want to be free. insist on being free, but when it comes right down to it, far too many people prefer to be equal rather than free. And there is one place, I think it's in chapter 13 of book 2, part 2 in volume 2, where he talks about how we, with liberty, you can say, all right, I've got enough. I mean, I have my freedom to organize. I have my freedom to buy books. I have my freedom to, I have all my First Amendment freedoms. And so, I don't really need a freedom to gamble. I don't need another freedom to buy drugs. But with equality is, we're never satisfied with the amount of equality we have. And that I think it's one of his most powerful insights, that it really does, it is the worm in the apple. It just eats away at far too many people. There's no amount of equality that exists that will satisfy people that we've reached a basic state of equality. Until everybody is totally equal, and then in which case you have the kind of equality in servitude that he has warned against. But if you are going to try to put together equality and liberty, there are equality of condition, Tocqueville's term, which is confusing because what he means by that is just that we have no hereditary titles. People who come from nothing can rise to the heights of democratic society. We see that all around us in the professions, in science, in inventions, in the internet world, where people under 30 have become billionaires because they've developed an app in their garage. But so we see this is equality of condition, but it doesn't lead to equality of outcome for everyone, where everyone is the same. And that gnaws at people, because it's what we would call the equality of opportunity that leads to an inequality of results. And no matter how much we equalize conditions, if, for instance, we now have scholarships for students to go to college, it's still not enough, because they get to college and they see that some kids have gone to expensive private schools and they went to a junkie school, and they don't have all of the same polish as other students do. I see this all the time. The more effort you make to offer students an equality of opportunity, the equality to go to a fine undergraduate institution, but then they get there, well, I don't have the clothes that other people have. Other people can travel back home for spring break, for Thanksgiving. I can't afford to do that. And so colleges and universities then respond to all of those additional demands and provide travel expenses or clothing allowances. And so Tocqueville's point is that there's just no one place where people are going to be satisfied that they have enough equality. Even though he does say in the preface that the Americans have taken equality as far as it can go. I mean, I hope when you read that you laughed, because we can see that there was a lot further that we could go down that road than Tocqueville wrote in the preface. So you have this tension between equality and liberty in democratic societies. And part of Tocqueville's liberalism is to want somehow to shore up those places where people can act for themselves and do something, change things, feel that they have the agency, the power to effect some change for the better in their world. So Are there any questions, comments yet? Okay. All right. So his point of departure is the equality of conditions that he talks about at the beginning of volume 1. And one of the things that just about every scholar who has, or every student who has read Democracy in America all the way through, has noted is that volume 1 talks about a particular danger that faces democratic societies. And that is the danger of the tyranny of the majority. And then volume 2 it gives us a different picture of what the danger facing democratic society will be. And that's his long discussion of what today, just to put it in contemporary terms, we would call the nanny state, the bureaucratic state, the deep state, if we want to sound really sinister about it. But the way in which bureaucrats really govern and rule our lives, down to now our stoves, wearing seatbelts, telling you not to eat the wrapper on the pretzels that you get on the airplane, in which they infantilize citizens of a free republic, and that's his point, that it turns us into perpetual children, where we have to be told to put on our bicycle helmet, required to wear a bicycle helmet or seat belts, or not to drink and drive or smoke when you're pregnant, or drink when you're pregnant. I mean, some of these things are good advice, but a lot of it becomes increasingly just a kind of nagging. So how do we get from the tyranny of the majority in book 1 to the democratic despotism in book 2, which I think is an interesting thought. But first, there's also another comparison that suggests itself to us, and that is James Madison's discussion of majority faction in book 1, in Federalist 10, where he talks about the danger of majority faction, which is either an interest or a passion that is opposed to the minority, or to minority or individual rights, or is opposed to the common good. Tocqueville here says the idea of majority faction, majority tyranny, is very difficult to protect against. So in other words, he is raising questions about whether Madison's solution is adequate to the task. If all political power ultimately is based on the power of the majority, then how can, if the majority writes the laws, the majority executes the laws, the majority appoints the judges who judge the laws, how can you escape from majority tyranny? And he says that principally we escape from it through our mores and our habits, that there aren't really that many instances of it. When Tocqueville is talking about majority tyranny in the first volume, he means the states, what's going on in the small republics, to use Montesquieu's distinction, the small republics, which are the states. And there, and so to some extent, perhaps Madison's solution of the large republic does help to overcome majority tyranny in the states. But then Tocqueville gives you 2 examples of majority tyranny. One is mob violence, where a mob just breaks into a jail and kills journalists. And the second is more insidious because it's the white majority that subtly dissuades free blacks, citizens, from exercising their right to vote in Pennsylvania. But then he goes on in the next chapter to talk about something else that he didn't include in his discussion of tyranny of the majority, and that is the tyranny of the tyranny of the mind. And he makes the argument that when public opinion has settled itself on what the proper opinion is, there really is not anyone who can stand up, resist, offer a different opinion on that. And he goes so far as to say that in America, there is no freedom of mind. It's really interesting to have these two chapters back to back, because on the one hand, he's talking about how majority tyranny of the kind of violent majority or oppressive majority, but this is just the tyranny of popular sovereignty, that people don't, people are not, don't feel that they can stand up once the majority has taken a position. And you can think of instances of that, people who might question modern feminism or question gay marriage or question abortion, to take the social issues that divide us here in this country, and how difficult it is for people to stand up and express a different opinion. I talk to my students about this a lot because we've been discussing controversial subjects in American political thought. We've been reading critical race theory. We've been reading opponents of critical race theory. And students have said that they are reluctant to express opinions on these subjects because they fear what other of their classmates may say, what they may write about them on social media for having expressed an idea in class. And so I think there is this way in which this is a very important theme that Tocqueville gets at. This goes beyond what Madison is talking about with the majority faction. Madison doesn't say anything about the tyranny of the mind, or that Americans in 1835, no less, not today, where we have all sorts of ways of communicating. But nobody feels that they can say what is really on their mind, which then I think promotes a kind of individualism that he talked about, where you can only get together in your little pod and say what you really think. These are themes that Tocqueville addresses in the first volume when he talks about the tyranny of the majority. But then he goes in the second volume to democratic despotism. And the great precursor to democratic despotism is centralization. And as I said, the French have a long tradition of centralization. The Americans do not have a long tradition of centralization, but it came with a vengeance when it finally did arrive here. And so the danger that he sees in the end is that you have people who feel so weak that they need the state to provide for them. And the reason that they feel weak, and this goes back to what Professor Mitchell was saying last time, is that all of the mediating institutions either have been abolished or are very weak and inconsequential. And as a result, there's very little that comes between them and the central government. And Tocqueville he talks, usually people know chapter 6. It's a famous chapter, the kind of despotism democratic nations have to fear. But the two chapters leading up to it and the chapter after it are really important because, first of all, they apply more to Europe than they do to the United States. At least the two preceding chapters, he talks about that specifically, and talks about the tendency to have centralized government, no mediating institutions, no religion. And so this makes individuals feel weak and dependent. It's not that they're out there now, suppressing the minority, but that they themselves feel so needy and so weak. And so if we can take a look at chapter 4 in volume 2, in part 4, he talks about accidental causes that centralize power in democracies. And he said there that Americans have strong habits of liberty. They brought these things over with them, the idea of individual rights, of a free press, of, again, the right of association, which he says is almost as natural a right as the right to speak, to associate. Tocqueville, again, sees us as social animals, and especially in democracy, the only way that we're going to accomplish anything is to come together with like-minded people to get it done, because we are not strong enough individually to get it done. So he talks about America. Americans take part in public affairs. They have the rights of free speech and free press. They have individual rights. And this is really important because he sees a tendency in democracy. And this is, again, I think, part of the tyranny of the majority. That the majority doesn't want to respect the rights of the individual. The majority takes much more a utilitarian view of the common good. That is the greatest good for the greatest number, and the rights of the individual be damned. So you have, and of course he carries on a correspondence with John Stuart Mill, who reviewed both volumes of Democracy in America. So he's well aware of this utilitarian philosophy that has emerged. But in America, we still, he says, value individual rights, and we have virile mores. Think about that. But revolutions tend to centralize power. Also, ignorance tends to centralize power. There's a marvelous quotation in the first volume where he's talking about whether other countries can adopt the federal model, federalism. It's one of the most important discoveries in American political science, federalism, distributing power between intermediate governments and the central government. And he says you have to have an intelligent people to have federalism. So ask yourself, if you want to license your dog, which government do you go to license your dog? Which government do you go to if you have a complaint about lights in your town or stop signs in your town? Where do you go if a river is polluted? If someone is breaking various laws, you have to know what branch of government is the one that's charged with that. And most people, he says, it requires a certain amount of intelligence, and ignorant people, people resistant to this kind of knowledge, is not going to be able to handle a federal and decentralized system of government. Just tell me I go to the central government, make it easy for me, and then I'll be much happier. And so he says a simple idea, even if it's wrong, will have far more compelling power than a complicated idea that's right. And that is a point that I never fail to emphasize to my students, that we have a very complicated constitutional system, and now made more complicated by the interface of the administrative state with the three constitutional branches of government that we are all familiar with from Schoolhouse Rock. So, so this is part of the problem, is just that if you don't have any tradition of federalism or decentralization, it's very hard to try to get people excited about it because it's overwhelming and it's complicated. So you have, and one of the things that revolutions do is sweep away every vestige of the old regime. And if there are, for instance, independent power centers, they go, and they don't come back with alternative independent power centers that will that are compatible with democracy. They just get rid of them altogether. The other thing that centralizes power, and God knows we have seen it in the United States after the Iraq War or the War on Terror or 9/11, is that war centralizes power. You have the Department of Homeland Securities. In World War I, you had Woodrow Wilson commandeering the railroads. You had all sorts of limitations on freedom of speech. So it constricts speech and it centralizes power. And then it's hard to get that power back after the war is over. One wonders whether the war on COVID will have some of the same, and I'm deliberately using that term, some of the same centralizing possibilities. He also mentions that how dangerous it is to come to the end of the revolutionary period, because people are worn out from the revolution, and what they want, to put it in an American term, is a return to normalcy. Thomas Jefferson worried about this too. In one of his despairing moments, he wrote, this is from the notes on Virginia, now is the time to fix all of our essential rights. After the revolution is over, it will all be going downhill. The people will forget about protecting their rights and will devote themselves to the sole art of making money. It's really quite marvelous. But so this period, this transition from the revolution to governing, to democracy, without the revolutionary passions motivating it. And Tocqueville says the revolution has to come to an end. But then what you replace it with ought to be these decentralized institutions that enable people to accomplish things for themselves that are within their own power, and not just send everything off to, or allow everything to be shipped off to the central government. And he says, talking of accidental things, he talks about what did it mean to centralize power? And in this chapter, he talks about charities. Now we have a welfare state. you don't have charities. Charities dispense their beneficence as they best see fit. What you want is a government that is impartial, that just shovels money at everybody who needs it, doesn't look at their motives, doesn't look at whether they're deserving. All of these are big arguments and debates in America at the end of the 19th century, led partly by Theodore Roosevelt. So charities become centralized or nationalized. Schools, of course, become another area of government concern. Religion, where oftentimes ministers or priests may be paid by the federal or by the central government, even if they no longer sit in parliament. Savings banks, again, set up by the government to protect the savings of the working class, so they don't have to keep their hard-earned money under a mattress at home. The growth of public administration as a science. All of these things really make possible progressivism, and they make possible the transformation of the classical liberal state to the welfare state. It's all of these ways. These are all ways in which, again, the intermediary institutions get absorbed by the federal government, and then the intermediary institutions become very, very weak by comparison. He also talks about, and this I found fascinating, it really is a chapter that people don't read that often, but I think it's important. In chapter 5, he talks about the way in which governments regard industrial property, and how that is different from the way in which they regard landed property. And Tocqueville makes the point that the state always thought that it had more control over industry than it did over, estates, landed property. And so they could make far more inroads on corporations than they could on plantations. And that's another way in which the modern state increases its power. The rise of the industrial economy also then gives much more than agrarian societies, gives rise to boom and bust cycles, and therefore leads to demands that the government do something about these boom and bust cycles. And the government is ready to step right in. It also develops more political economy. It has more tools, economic tools at its disposal. It has more administrative tools at its disposal. And it comes to regard lots of corporations as simply public utilities rather than private corporations. And it exercises more control over private associations. Any private association that discriminates, for instance, against women is automatically suspect. Think of the Augusta, the Masters tournament. I don't play golf, so I don't know much about it, but I do know that there's always a big brouhaha because apparently the Masters doesn't permit women. Private clubs in cities in America that have limited their membership in some way. Can you do that anymore? So these are all ways by which the government centralizes its power and control over all of those mediating institutions. And it's very interesting to see Tocqueville get down into the weeds on these things, I think. So then in chapter 6, he talks about democratic despotism. The chapter is it's 663. Let's just see here. This is, you all probably know this passage is one, but it's just so beautifully put. This is at the bottom of, well, it's the whole page actually. Above these, an immense tutelary power is elevated, which alone takes charge of assuring their enjoyments and watching over their fate. X-rated movies, anybody? It is absolute, detailed, regular, far-seeing, and mild. It would resemble paternal power if, like that, it had as its object to prepare men for manhood. But on the contrary, it seeks only to keep them irrevocably fixed in childhood. It likes citizens to enjoy themselves, provided that they think only of enjoying themselves. It willingly works for their happiness, but it wants to be the unique agent and sole arbiter of that. It provides for their security, foresees and secures their needs, facilitates their pleasures, conducts their principal affairs, directs their industry, regulates their estates, divides their inheritance. Can it not take away from them entirely the trouble of thinking and the pain of living? And then he goes on to say, it's a network of small, complicated, painstaking, uniform rules through which the most original minds and the most vigorous souls cannot clear a way to surpass the crowd. It does not break wills, but it softens them, bends them, and directs them. It rarely forces one to act, but it constantly opposes itself to one's acting. It does not destroy. It prevents things from being born. It does not tyrannize. It hinders, compromises, enervates, extinguishes, dazes, and finally reduces each nation to nothing more than a herd of timid and industrial animals of which the government is the shepherd. So there is, I think, someone last time raised the connection between Nietzsche and Tocqueville, and it's that passage of human beings being reduced to a herd of timid animals, which is the point of contact between the two of them. Tocqueville, however, thinks that it need not be this way, whereas Nietzsche, of course, is all too happy to just give the back of his hand to maggot man, as he calls the Democrats. This is, for him, endemic. For Tocqueville, this is the problem to be overcome. And in chapter 7, he has some possible remedies for this tyranny or bureaucratic despotism. And again, we go back to the table that Professor Mitchell set last time, which is the secondary bodies. The art of association is so critical to a healthy democracy because individuals feel weak and they can acquire something of the power that an aristocrat feels by uniting together with others. And so associations give us the power and the sense of agency that we can actually accomplish something. So that's really important. A free press. We should really pause over that because there are so many questions about whether there is a free press anymore, in the sense that so much news is suppressed that is not that does not fit the narrative. So it's not now that the news is distorted, just a lot of it never gets out at all. through the regular mainline sources of news. So he says a free press, and you can see why this is so. You have to know what's going on. You have to know what's going on with your government. You have to know what your politicians are proposing. You have to be able, need the information to evaluate it, and you need a free press to perform that duty. We also need courts. And again, the politicization of the courts is a problem. You want an independent judiciary. And Tocqueville earlier on had talked about the importance of lawyers. To lawyers who simply who lose themselves in all of the precedents that are so necessary. And again, democracies have no patience with all these precedents and all these arcane rules of the law. They just want to get rid of it. They just want the decision to come out the way they want it. And Tocqueville says that's why the lawyers and the courts are so vital, provided that the lawyers and the courts don't become French. By which he means in France, the lawyers are much more abstract. They don't wait for a case and controversy to arise, but Tocqueville says they pronounce judgments on what is or is not lawful in the abstract. They're willing to take on much bigger cases. We need the whole question of standing in America limits what it is that courts can take on. And Tocqueville thinks that all these things are really good, that courts and lawyers should not become philosophers. They should be chained down by precedent, as Thomas Jefferson once wrote. This is a very good thing. But again, over time, our understanding of courts and lawyers in America has shifted dramatically from the way in which Tocqueville describes them in 1835 and in 1840. He also talks about the importance of forms, and this is connected with secondary or mediating institutions, but it's also connected with the forms of politeness, the things that give us a certain distance, so that you don't, waitresses and waiters don't come up to you and say, "Hi guys, I'll be your server today." You can't say waitress or waiter anymore, but I'll be your server. And sort of want to join in, perhaps, sit down, have a bite of what you're having at the table. That there is no sense of distance or respect anymore. Everything is just sort of face to face, without any of the polite forms of society that are so essential. And he says that Democrats especially are impatient with all these forms. And yet these forms, in part, are all of the form. A form is federalism. You want to get rid of it just so that you know that you always and only go to one government. The forms in our social life, in our private life, in our public life are so important. When the Congress people say, "My good friend from across the aisle," of course they don't mean it, but these are the forms of politeness that keep them from absolutely exploding in a public forum. And so Tocqueville reminds us that we need these things, that democracy is not, in the name of equality, breaking down every single form. Starting with casual Friday, and next thing you know, it's casual every day, and there's no difference, and people don't dress any differently if they're going to church or if they're going to a baseball game. All of these things he thinks are just not good for a democracy. He also emphasizes the significance, the need to protect individual rights against the utilitarian concern with the greatest good, because after all, if the democracy is if the majority rules in a democracy, then what the democracy will say, well, we want our position to be advanced, and the rights of the minority need to bend to that. And we still in the United States have an emphasis on protecting individual rights rather than spotty, but we have it. And it's good to be aware that there are two competing democratic traditions, one of utilitarianism, where you emphasize the greatest good for the greatest number, which could be that impious and detestable maxim that the majority has no limiting principle other than its own will. And finally, he mentions this, and this I think comes from his reading of Machiavelli, where he says that politicians make arguments that we have to do this because necessity requires it. All we have to do is think back to COVID, all the things that necessity required. That is an argument that just provides government with the opportunity to ride roughshod over individual rights, all for the sake of protecting us. So these are some ways. So unlike Nietzsche, Tocqueville tries to point out ways in which, first of all, we can identify the problem. Not all democracy is detestable, as Nietzsche argues. There is a desirable form of democracy. It's a democracy that understands the proper relationship between liberty and equality, that does not push equality too far, because pushing equality too far also results in centralization and the increase of government power over more and more details of ordinary life. And so Tocqueville gives you remedies for the problems that he diagnoses. I think I've covered in short order just about everything except the brief chapter on democratic historians, which is quite wonderful. And there is a hand up. Fine. Yes. Well, Charlie, let me, democratic historians, same point there. And I'll get back to it in a minute, but let me answer your question.
Thank you for being with us, Professor Yarbrough. It's really been a pleasure. My question relates to Tocqueville's analysis of Christianity, and it seems like that is a very key buttress for democracy, just in general, as well as in America. But would Tocqueville have regarded, the transformation? I'm particularly thinking of like stuff like the social gospel in the 20th century transformation of American Christianity into something less transcendent and more material world. Would he have regarded that as an adequate substitute?
No, I don't think so. And the chapter that you would want to look at is the one on pantheism, which is very short. But what, in effect, he says, and this is another example of equality gone way beyond where it needs to go. But what offends radical egalitarians is that there is a creator God and we are creatures, because that means we're not equal. I mean, he created us. We are not his equal. And so what you wind up with is pantheism, that there is no creator God. There is the spark of the divine in everything, from the ant that crawls on the ground up to humanity. And we're all equal in that sense. And the language that he uses there is an immense body, that we're all sort of swallowed up in this divinity. And if everything is divine, C.S. Lewis says you can't account for evil. So you have two problems. One is you can't account for evil if everything has a spark of divinity, but the impulse to move in that direction is to get rid of the last and critical remaining inequality, which is God. And I have students, I teach parts of the Bible, because students, as colleges become much more diverse, I have students who have never read the Bible. They're Hindus, they're Muslims. The Hindus, they're not even people of the book, and they're like, you could hand them Grimm's fairy tales, and they say, and then what happened? So I have to teach these things. But what I get back from students now is this indignation: who's God to tell me what to do? Which is that egalitarian impulse. I am capable of giving myself my own moral law. So I don't think that Tocqueville would regard those things as adequate substitutes, because the point is not to redistribute wealth on earth, but the point is somehow to gain everlasting life. And you don't do that. You can't have the focus be simply on improving the material lot of the suffering. It doesn't mean that you don't concern yourself with that up to a point. But, that was why Mother Teresa was so controversial. But that's a long story. And I see Ugo wants to ask a question, I think. Yes?
Yeah, here I am. Thank you, Professor Yarbrough. When I was checking democracy in America, I got very interested in two things. The first is, the whole defense of civil society and intermediate bodies. And the other is the dangers of the tyranny of the majority. And I am particularly interested in that section of the book, because Tocqueville also has another book that you might be very well aware of, his reflections on the revolution in 1848.
Yeah.
So yeah. So when I first read the reflections on the revolutions, there was a quote that said that everyone was united there was something about those who had nothing united in common hatred, and those who had anything united in common fear. So my point, or my question for you was, do you think that maybe the promotion that Tocqueville tries to give to the civil society and to intermediate bodies is a way to compensate against the danger for the tyranny of the majority? Because that's usually what happens, at least in Latin America or in Eastern Europe. You don't have a civil society strong enough for a tyranny not to happen. You can get like examples that would be dear to the right. Let's say Orban in Hungary, because Hungary doesn't have that much of a civil society. Or in Latin America, you have like plenty of caudillos and other strongmen, pretty much in the same way. But that's because we don't have a decentralized civil society that kind of compensates all of the excesses of democracy.
Well, I'm going to ignore your comment about the souvenirs, which I know, but I just think I want to just focus more on the general problem. And this gets me back to something that I said earlier in response to your question to Professor Mitchell or last time. And that is that one of the things that interested Tocqueville a lot, and he studied Islam. He went to Algeria and studied Muslim culture, read the Quran. He was very interested in Hinduism and in how Indian culture and how that worked. There's been a little bit of work that's been done on this sort of comparative religions, and that every religion affects its citizens. But Tocqueville in Democracy in America distinguishes between Protestants and Catholics. And I think it matters a lot which of those two traditions forms your country. And if you have a Catholic country, it's obviously going to be more hierarchical than a congregational society, which is what America first was. And that leads to very different views about intermediary organizations. That doesn't mean you can't have them, but you have a different culture in which you have to develop them, and they won't look exactly the same. You can't just take the American Constitution and export it. You have to make accommodations to the different cultural expectations. So I think that is part of the problem. I mean, part of the problem in the East European countries is that for so many years they were under Soviet domination, and they lived in a state, as you say, of fear. And in South America and Central America, I don't really know what the problem is. I'm very interested. I mean, there are more strong men there. I mean, even the term banana republic comes from south of the border, though we're using it an awful lot these days right here in our own country. So I don't know beyond just pointing to cultural differences. I think each country it would be very important for people in South America, as in China, which they're doing, to be reading the works of Tocqueville, because I think Tocqueville has something important to say about bureaucratic despotism, about the importance of mediating institutions, about the importance of religion. And if you look at social science today, I mean, the idea is the more developed you are, the more secular you become. But Tocqueville, I think, would at least put the brakes on some of that enthusiasm for secularism. Are those helpful comments?
Yeah, I mean,
No.
no, of course they are. It's just that I'm trying to make sense, because I'm having like this three-way clash of civilizations in my head between the American influence, Central European cultural society, and my own Latin American background.
And what is it? ¿De dónde viene?
I was born and raised in Ecuador. I'm currently living in Poland.
Yeah, I remember that. I know you're in
Yeah.
Poland right now, but I didn't know where in South America.
I come from the true, authentic, original Banana Republic, Ecuador.
And now
So,
you're in Poland studying.
Yeah, law.
Why?
So, yeah.
Why did you study?
Why Poland?
Yeah, I mean, is there a tradition of law that you can bring back to your own country, or do you not want to practice law in Ecuador?
No, it's actually a special program from the Catholic University of America. They have this joint program with the Jagiellonian University at Krakow, and I got the chance because why not? I hold an Italian passport because my parents are Italian as well. So coming to Europe was pretty easy. And I've been really interested in the Polish constitutional development since the years of the Commonwealth, because I think they are kind of underrated, and it could be useful for Latin America because we have also a Catholic culture, and a
But
history
again,
of disintegration.
but you also have to take into account the differences. So I would recommend especially that you focus on the end of Democracy in America, where he talks about all these different developments that affect the emergence of or the existence of mediating institutions. I think there's another hand up, so I'm going to cut you short for now, but I will see you very soon.
Absolutely.
I
Thank you
look
very
forward
much.
to it. And now, who has a question? Yes, isn't there a hand up? Nope.
I think that was still Ugo's hand, but it actually brings us to the end of our time here today. Thank you so much, Professor Yarbrough, this week, and Dr. Mitchell for last week for this true Tocqueville masterclass that you've shared with us. Dr. Mitchell, I think we are now prepared to go into the library with tears in our eyes, ready to see the spot where Democracy in America was written. So thank you all again so much. We will see you in Normandy in a couple of weeks.
I so look forward to it. Thank you so much. This was just a joy to do. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Anything else, Thibaut?
Thank you, everyone. No, just saying that I'm also looking forward to meet all of you in person in Tocqueville, and I'm really happy that we started doing these conferences last year, because it's important to have some background on what you're gonna saw in Normandy and what you're gonna visit. And I'm also very interested in learning more about Tocqueville, because I work for the foundation, but I still have many things to learn, and I'm looking forward to see you all in Normandy. And if you have any question, do not hesitate to write or call or anything. And for Professor Yarbrough and Josh, I'm gonna send you a detailed program and give you all the information regarding your stay at Tocqueville. And also do not hesitate if you have anything to ask.
Thank you very much. I think all my questions have been answered. One thing I would say to the students, if you can get a copy of The Old Regime, and look at the third book, and just a second, I have it. Well, I won't. I think it's pages 216 and 217. I've looked at it a lot. It's the end of a chapter where it's a meditation on freedom and what freedom is. That is so beautiful that you really should read that before you step into the library. I think that will just absolutely cap your tearful experience, and mine too. It's so beautiful. It always just chokes me up reading it. So I just like to leave you on that note, that freedom is something precious, and Tocqueville captured it perfectly in those 2 pages.
And the manuscript is actually at the library at the castle of the Old Regime. I think they sold the manuscript for Democracy in America in order to pay for the renovation of the castle after the fire. But I think there is still the manuscript there. So if Jean-Guillaume doesn't think to show you, you definitely have to ask and see how Tocqueville worked and how he wrote at the time. It's quite interesting.
I look forward to that very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you
Bye.
very
Have a
much.
good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Not for you.